Hi ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mr. Kellogg and I am the teacher that runs the Video Games as Literature classroom that this Patreon is based on, teaching with video games. And so I wanted to start off this video by basically talking about grants, how you can apply for grants in your classroom and how those can hopefully be used in order to buy technology for your classroom. Right behind me on both sides I have TVs. All of these things were purchased with grant money in order to support my Video Game as Literature classroom. And obviously as teachers we want to provide really fun enrichment activities to our students, and we want to do our best to make sure that they're experiencing things that they might not otherwise be able to experience, and that's often why we apply to grants. I'm going to be spending some time basically talking about belief, how we can use our own belief in our classrooms and what we do and how that influences our writing. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is scope, and so that's going to be our national scope, our local scope, and then obviously our state scope. And then the very last thing is going to be our purpose. So when we apply for grants, what is the purpose of us applying for this grant? And I think that's a really huge part of that. And so I'm going to break up these three things. Let's get into it. So one of the very first things that I want to talk about is belief. And this may seem like a very obvious thing, but when I've applied for grants, belief in my own work is a really important thing. And as teachers, I feel like sometimes we can kind of go, oh, what I'm doing is just something that everyone else is doing, or I'm just, adding on to something that's already been done. But that belief in our own work is a very, very huge part, especially when writing grants. If you start off writing a grant and you already think to yourself, I'm probably not going to get this grant. I don't know if I have the writing skills necessarily in order to write and achieve this. That is definitely going to influence your writing. It's going to get to the point where as you're writing, you might put in caveats that say, well, if I'm good enough for this grant, or if I deserve this, instead of definitively stating why you actually believe the grant and why you actually deserve it. And so having that belief is actually a huge part. And again, it may seem like a duh, but you want to make sure that you're actually taking the time to write down what is the idea that you want in your grant. Take some time to actually brainstorm before you just really quickly, train of thought write out a grant and say, you know what, if I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. Taking a little amount of time to have belief and forethought before you actually get started in the grant writing process can be a very, very big deal. Now, the second thing in regards to belief that I want to talk about is having an overall idea of what you want to use grant funds for. Now, obviously, this seems like a duh before you apply for a grant, but in order to have belief in oneself, we need to actually have an understanding of what is that money going to be spent on. And so what is that purpose that we're going to be actually using the grant funds with? And so belief kind of has two separate levels. We've got personal belief, and that's obviously something that some people have an easier time getting than others. The next thing is making others believe in your ideas. And you can't really do that until you can articulate what you want to use grant money for. And so an example. Right behind me, I have tons of comic books. Now, some of these were purchased by me, but a lot of them were actually purchased for a comic book in the classroom grant that I applied for, and I was able to receive. And so it's going to be really important that you do your best in order to not only believe in your work, but try and expand your classroom and actually apply for things that might help students. And so for my own personal belief, I believe that comics belong in the classroom. I believe that they should be used in the classroom. And so I did my best to apply to a grant and say, hey, I believe they deserve to be in the classroom, and then the purpose of that grant being to get students reading more. And the amount of times I've had students actually use comics in the classroom has been very big based on that idea. Now, one that's more video game oriented. I have 35 Game Boys in my classroom, and I was able to purchase those from a grant from Northwest Community Credit Union, which is a local credit union in my area. And I was able to basically get that grant by saying, here's why I believe I should get it, having that personal belief that Game Boys can actually be used to teach state standards, and then following through that when I wrote that grant. And so a really big part is that belief. You want to make sure that you're doing your best in order to show that you have belief in yourself. The next thing that I want to talk about is scope. And so obviously there's multiple different types of grants that are out there, and a lot of the times the big ones that are pushed on us are national level scholarships and grants. And it can be very, very tempting to apply to these, but it's really important to go in understanding that a lot of the times, especially if you're just scrolling through Facebook, if there's a national grant that's marketed just to you, it's not just being marketed at you, it's being marketed at thousands of teachers in the hopes that they apply, and some of them are legitimate. Some of them honestly just want you to apply so that way they can get your email, and then they can actually use that to sell to other marketing entities. And so always be a little bit cautious when you're looking at the national level for grants. I typically recommend going to what your subject area is and actually looking up. So for instance, I'm an English teacher, so we have the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, and so I use a lot of their websites in order to find grants for my specific subject area. When I'm applying for grants for video games as literature, I'll often look for technology-based grants and do my best to expand expand the scope a little bit, but go in knowing that national grants are going to be much more difficult to earn. Now, a really important thing is making sure that that doesn't attack your belief. Still believe that you can get it, but just know that it's going to be a lot more people inside of the pool that are applying for those grants. Now, the next level down from national, I would consider state. And so your state is going to have some grants for teachers that are going to be specific year by year. Sometimes those grants are going to be specific for your classroom. Sometimes it's going to be teacher education grants where they want you to actually go out and go to professional development. And you can actually usually find these on your state website. I'm from Oregon, and so I was able to go on the Oregon teaching website and find multiple that are listed, some at the state level, and then there's even some links to more national ones. And so I'll do my best to add in a link to the Oregon one, but each state is going to have their own actual list of grants and scholarships available for teachers each year. This is a much smaller pool than the national level. And so typically I recommend that you guys should definitely apply for state grants anytime you have the ability to, because that belief piece is actually going to weed out a lot of teachers that don't have the personal belief in order to apply for these. And so sadly, that helps you in a way, because if less people are applying, that just means that you have a higher chance of getting your really awesome grant funded. And so you want to make sure that you're applying to these state ones. Now, the next level below that, which I think is very important to talk to your principal, talk to your school district to figure out, are local grants. And I live in a state that's actually very lucky to have tons of local grants, both at the community level and local grants that are actually from businesses in my community. And so I would recommend making sure that you're actually looking out for these local grants, because then you go state where you've got tons of people, you've got national where you have even more. By the time you're getting down to your local level, you're probably competing with about 12 other teachers, maybe less in your local area that are applying for these grants. And so do your best to make sure that you guys are applying for these, but looking for ones at your local level, and credit unions are a really great way to do that. So if you have any local credit unions, in this past year, we actually have 4 or 5 smaller level credit unions in our area. They love giving back to teachers. And so I was able to get a few different scholarships and grants for my classroom specifically from credit unions. And so I recommend doing your best to look at their websites, see what yearly submission periods they have. And those are typically a lot easier, where typically they're only looking for about 500 words, maybe a link that shows what you explain or want to do, as to an article that explains how it's actually sustainable. But those are very easy grants to apply to. And so you want to make sure that you're doing your best to look at these different levels, but the local level is typically where I always begin, and then I move upward instead of starting at the national level down. Because if you put in hundreds of hours, and it can sometimes feel like that, typically closer to dozens, applying to grants at the national level, you're typically getting a lot more negative feedback, a lot more denials, a lot more no comments back, and that happens more often than not in grants where they just say nothing. At the local level, though, I've always gotten responses saying, hey, thank you for your time, thanks for that submission. And if you work in the same district for multiple years, the chances that you get these grants just increases with time. And so always make sure that you guys are looking at that, the national level, the state level, the local level, and then start from the bottom up, so that way you have the best chance of getting these grants. The very last thing I want to talk about is purpose. And so every single time I apply to a grant, sometimes if I don't get a grant, it's because I spent too much time talking about the fun, awesome new thing that we're going to get, and not the purpose of these items in response to the educational area that we're in. And so if I'm applying for a grant, let's say for Game Boys, I would definitely not have gotten that grant if I just said, give me technology, I want to see technology, with no purpose behind why that technology should be bought for the classroom. And so every single time that I apply for a grant, I always look at the submission and the choosing criteria. So most grants typically have a link to all of the different things that are rules, requirements, and usually inside of that really long list of stuff, it'll say, grants will be chosen based on X criteria. And so you want to make sure that you're looking for that, because typically, if I look at Game Boys, let's say, and it says in their search criteria they're looking for technology that helps with educational objectives, well, as a teacher, I better have those educational objectives. I better have those state standards that actually say how I'm going to achieve what I want to with that. And so never ever, especially for a video game as literature class, for teaching with video games, don't apply to a grant and just say, give me technology because it'll make it awesome. You have to have an actual reason. And that's typically why I see a lot of people not end up getting grants, is they're just like, give me, and they're not actually laying out a plan for how they're going to use that technology inside of the classroom. And so inside of my class, we use the Game Boys to actually journal, basically go through with our Pokemon and see how we're going through and actually playing the game. And then there's a lot of different check-ins that I do. So journal entries, a lot of writing involved, and then that helps students actually find out what their voice is as they're going through on a fun Pokemon journey. And so that little little thing that I did there, taking the technology, giving the purpose, that's going to make it so you're writing a grant that's a lot more in-depth, and you're a lot more likely to actually get that if you do that. And so just make sure that as you guys are going through, especially if you're talking about self-belief, I can believe as much as I want that Game Boys can really help my classroom, but unless I can articulate that and actually say how it's going to help an educational purpose, I'm probably not going to get that grant. And so make sure that you guys are always bringing it back to the purpose, looking at the fine line in the grant to see why they're choosing the grants they are, and you'll most likely get it if you actually follow through these steps. And so obviously this isn't going to help everyone get their grants. This isn't going to be a how-to instant win scenario, but I think these little things are just things that we can do as teachers in order to help us build the classrooms that we want to and add the awesome things that we think make our classrooms, better for all students. And so as you guys are thinking about applying for grants, just do your best to definitely pay attention to ones that are coming up in the fall season, because I'm assuming not too many are still actually open in the spring when this video is going to be posted. And so I'll probably send out a reminder video just talking about some of the local ones and national ones I'm applying to later, but this should hopefully just help out a few people that are looking for how to use grants, how to apply to some inside of the classroom. And so with that said, guys, thank you so much. Please do your best to continue supporting my Patreon and go to teachingwithvideogames.com if you want to support me some more. Have a great day. Peace.